All right, so today we're going to do a deep dive into karma yoga. But I think before we start, I just want to clarify this isn't about like the physical postures. It's not about like getting all bendy. We're going to be exploring like the philosophy behind it. And I think you're going to find it pretty interesting. Our guide for this deep dive is a lecture I found on Swami Vivekananda's teachings. And it's pretty fascinating, actually. This lecture it really like flipped my whole perspective on work and freedom, even like reality itself. So
Yeah.
basically, it all boils down to this question: how can we find freedom? And not just like in our circumstances, but like within ourselves. That's where karma yoga comes in. So the lecture starts out by explaining that karma yoga, it's not about like escaping the world or anything. It's about finding liberation through action, specifically unselfish action, which I thought was kind of paradoxical at first because I was like, wait, isn't any action better than no action?
Well, I think what's interesting here is the concept of selfishness,
Yeah.
right? Because the lecture argues that even good deeds, they can be driven by selfish motives. Like, think about, like donating to charity just to impress your friends, or volunteering just to get that like warm, fuzzy feeling of being a good person.
Yeah.
And it's not that, like those actions are bad.
Yeah.
But they're still bound by this desire for personal gain.
So it's not just about what we do, but why we do it. Makes it a lot more complicated than just like checking things off a list.
Yeah, exactly. And the lecture connects this to the bigger picture, this concept of the universe, like always striving for balance. So every action we take, it creates these ripples. Some bind us to this cycle of desire, and some help us to break free.
Okay, I'm starting to see where this is going. So if our actions are motivated by selfish desires, we're basically just creating ripples that keep us trapped.
Precisely. And the lecture uses this brilliant analogy, I thought, to illustrate this. Imagine, like, trying to raise a wave in the ocean. You can't do that without creating a hollow somewhere else.
Right.
So it's like, it's a beautiful way to show how all of our actions, they have consequences, even if we don't see them immediately.
So even if we're trying to do good, if our motivation is off, we might actually be causing harm.
That's the idea. And this is where the lecture, like, really starts to challenge some of our, like, deeply held beliefs about creating a perfect world or achieving absolute equality.
Hold on, are you saying that striving for equality is a bad thing?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
But the lecture is suggesting that. These concepts, while appealing, they kind of ignore the inherent nature of creation and change, like this constant dance between balance and imbalance. It's what drives the universe forward. Imagine a world where everyone is exactly the same. It might sound peaceful, but would it really be a thriving, dynamic world?
I never thought of it that way. So are you saying we should just accept inequality?
Again, it's not about just like accepting things as they are, especially if they're causing suffering. But the lecture encourages us to kind of shift our perspective from like trying to force the world into a fixed state to understanding that true balance comes from embracing the ebb and flow of life.
That sounds pretty profound. I have to admit, it's a little bit overwhelming to think about putting this into practice. Like, how do I know if my actions are truly selfless? And what does it even look like to embrace the ebb and flow in everyday life?
That's where the example of Buddha comes in. The lecture highlights it. It's like the ultimate embodiment of karma yoga.
How did Buddha manage to navigate this? I'm ready for some concrete examples.
Well, what's remarkable is that he achieved enlightenment, not through isolation or intense meditation, but through selfless action in the world. And what's even more fascinating is his actions were like entirely devoid of any external motivation. So he wasn't seeking personal gain, fame, or even a place in heaven.
So he was just out there helping people with zero expectation of getting anything in return. That's pretty radical. Most of us are looking for at least a little recognition, right?
Right. It really challenges our usual way of thinking about motivation. The lecture highlights this with a quote about how he works best who works without any motive. It's from that pure intention, that genuine desire to alleviate suffering, that the power to transform the world truly emerges.
Okay, that quote, it really struck a chord with me. It makes me wonder, if we could truly let go of that need for personal reward, what kind of incredible things could we accomplish,
That's the heart of karma yoga. It's not about like gritting our teeth and forcing ourselves to be good. It's about cultivating a mindset where selfless action becomes natural, effortless almost, because it's aligned with our deepest values.
So it's not about becoming some kind of saint or martyr. It's about finding a way to act in the world that feels authentic
And fulfill.
and fulfill.
Exactly. It's about tapping into that, like inherent interconnectedness, that compassion that's within all of us. And when we act from that place, We unleash this source of energy and purpose. That's way more powerful than any external motivation could ever be.
That makes a lot of sense. But I'm still grappling with the practical side of things. Like, how do I even begin to cultivate that kind of selflessness in my daily life? It just feels like such a huge leap from where I am now.
Well, it starts with small steps. The lecture emphasizes the importance of self-awareness.
Hmm?
It's about like paying attention to your thoughts, feelings, intentions,
Hmm.
but without judgment, just observing them with curiosity.
So instead of beating myself up for having selfish thoughts, I just acknowledge them and try to understand where they're coming from.
Precisely. And as you become more aware of those patterns, you can start to make conscious choices that are more aligned with your values.
It's like training a muscle, right? The more you practice self-awareness, the stronger it becomes.
That's a great analogy. And it's important to remember that it's an ongoing process, right? There's no finish line, no point where you suddenly become perfectly selfless. It's about continually refining your actions and motivations.
That takes the pressure off, so it's not about being perfect. It's about progress.
Exactly. Now, another key aspect of karma yoga that the lecture touches on is this idea of embracing the world's constant state of flux, the ebb and flow between balance and imbalance. It's like a fundamental principle in a lot of Eastern philosophies.
But isn't that kind of unsettling to realize that there's no fixed endpoint, no ultimate state of perfection? It makes me feel like I'm constantly chasing a moving target.
It can be unsettling, but it can also be incredibly liberating. Think about it. If we let go of the illusion of control, this idea that we can somehow manipulate the world into this fixed state of our choosing, we free ourselves from a lot of unnecessary suffering.
So instead of trying to force things to be a certain way, we learn to accept what is and adapt to the ever-changing circumstances.
Precisely. And that's where true freedom lies, in surrendering to the present moment and accepting things as they are. It's like learning to dance with the chaos rather than trying to fight against it.
Okay, I like that image, but how does that translate to concrete actions? Does it mean I just give up on trying to make a difference in the world?
Not at all. In fact, when we embrace this perspective, it can actually make us more effective in our actions. Because we're not so attached to specific outcomes, we can act with clarity and purpose, but without clinging to the results.
So I can still work towards goal, but I don't let the outcome define my sense of worth or happiness.
Exactly. It's about finding that sweet spot between effort and surrender, between intention and acceptance.
I see. Now, the lecture also challenged this idea of absolute equality being a desirable or even attainable goal, right?
Yes. It argues that inequality is actually a necessary component of creation. Because without difference, without contrast, there would be no impetus for change or growth. Imagine a perfectly flat landscape. It might seem peaceful, but also be pretty boring. It's the mountains and valleys, the peaks and troughs that create that dynamic beauty of the world.
And in the same way, it's the differences between individuals that spark creativity, innovation, and progress.
Exactly. So instead of striving for a world where everyone is exactly the same, we should be celebrating our unique talents and perspectives. It's about recognizing that. Diversity is a strength, not a weakness.
That resonates with me. But this doesn't mean we should just ignore inequalities that cause suffering or injustice, right?
Of course not. We still have a responsibility to work towards a more just and equitable world. But the lecture suggests that our approach should be one of balance and understanding, rather than trying to impose a rigid uniformity.
So it's about finding ways to create a society where everyone has the opportunity to thrive, while still valuing and respecting our own individual differences.
Exactly. It's a nuanced perspective. That challenges us to think beyond simplistic solutions and embrace the complexity of the human experience. It's about recognizing that true equality isn't about everyone being the same. It's about creating a world where everyone has the freedom to be their authentic selves and to contribute their unique gifts to the world.
That's a powerful vision. Now, I know the lecture also talked about the world being like a giant machine, and honestly, that idea always kind of freaks me out. It makes me feel like I'm just a tiny cog with no real control over my destiny.
I understand that feeling. It can be overwhelming to think about the vastness and complexity of the universe. But the lecture offers two ways to navigate this feeling of being caught up in the machinery. The first is to detach completely, to step off the ride, so to speak.
So basically become a hermit and live off the grid.
That's the path of renunciation, withdrawing from the world and its entanglements. And while it's a valid path for some, the lecture acknowledges that it's not accessible or even desirable for most people.
Right, it's not exactly practical for most of us who live in the real world. Jobs and families and
Well,
all those other
totally.
entanglements.
So the other option is to embrace the machine, to learn its inner workings, and find a way to navigate it skillfully.
And that's where karma yoga comes in, right? It's about finding freedom through action rather than
It's
avoidance.
exactly. It's about understanding that we can't escape the world and its challenges, but we can learn to engage with them in a way that leads to liberation.
Okay, that makes sense. But how do we actually do that? How do we learn to navigate the machine skillfully without getting crushed by its gears?
It all comes back to those principles we were talking about before: self-awareness, selfless action, and embracing that ebb and flow of life. And I think it's about understanding that even though we're part of this huge system, our actions, they still matter. Even small acts of kindness and generosity, they can create like positive ripples that extend way beyond
All right,
ourselves.
so it's not about trying to control the whole machine. It's about focusing on what we can control, our own actions and intentions.
Exactly. And that brings us back to, karma yoga. It's not about passivity or resignation. It's about actively participating in the world, but with a different kind of mindset, a mindset that's grounded in, selflessness, compassion, and like a deep understanding of the interconnectedness of all things.
Oh, okay, yeah. That's starting to click for me. So, karma yoga, it's less about achieving some, grand outcome and more about shifting our perspective on how we approach our everyday lives.
You got it. It's about finding that, freedom and purpose within the journey itself, rather than attaching it to some distant goal. And the lecture uses a really powerful image to describe this. It talks about how each of us is like a unique instrument in like a vast orchestra. We all have our own part to play, our own unique sound to contribute.
Oh, I love that analogy. So, instead of comparing ourselves to others or trying to force ourselves to play someone else's tune, we should focus on mastering our own instrument.
Beautifully put. It's about embracing our individual strengths and talents and using them to create something harmonious and beautiful. And when we do that, we not only find fulfillment for ourselves, but we also contribute to like the overall harmony of the orchestra.
So, it's like even if we're just playing a small part, it still matters because it adds to the richness and depth of the whole composition.
Exactly. And the lecture emphasizes that, this doesn't mean we have to be like perfect musicians or even know the entire score. It's about showing up with an open heart,
Hmm.
a willingness to learn and a commitment to playing our part to the best of our ability.
It's about trusting that even if we can't see the big picture, our individual efforts are, contributing to something meaningful.
Yes. And that brings us back to that powerful message about acting without attachment to the outcome. Because when we're focused on playing our part authentically and with joy, the results, they tend to take care of themselves.
So it's about surrendering to the process, trusting the rhythm of the universe, and finding that sweet spot between effort and surrender.
You've got it. And that's the beauty of karma yoga. It's a path that's accessible to everyone, regardless of their background, beliefs, or circumstances. It's about taking those principles of selflessness, compassion, and mindful action and like weaving them into the fabric of our daily lives.
It's about recognizing that true freedom and purpose, they aren't found in some distant future, but in the present moment, in the choices we make and the actions we take right here, right now.
Precisely. And as we wrap up our deep dive into karma yoga, I hope our listeners are walking away with a sense of empowerment, knowing that they have the ability to choose how they engage with the world. They have the power to create positive ripples, to contribute to the harmony of the orchestra, and to find that deep sense of freedom and fulfillment that comes from living a life of purpose.
It's a powerful reminder that we're not just cogs in a machine, we're active participants in this grand symphony of life. And by embracing the principles of karma yoga, we can not only find liberation for ourselves, but also contribute to creating a more just, compassionate, and harmonious world for all. So, to all our listeners out there, keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep diving deep until next time.